who allegedly was the kind of author of the, or one of the authors anyway, of the fake elector scheme. Why would somebody ask for a quick trial? Because as you mentioned, delay has been the kind of theory, the approach in most of these indictments. And does that delinking mean anything substantive?
So I think we're a little bit looking at tea leaves here, but the delinking is kind of Chesrow delinking from Trump. And so for Trump, I think it is helpful to delay. For other people, that might not be the case. It could also be the case, and we're hypothesizing here, that he may be indicating not just that he's amenable to a speedy trial and wants this trial to continue, but it could also be an overture to settlement negotiations or to plea negotiations in this case. And it is possible that he thinks it is beneficial to him to be as distant from the former president as possible in time and space of these particular trials.
Which is a fascinating, as you say, tea leaf reading, but fascinating as this plays out. Is there a different standard? Help us think through how this case is successful and what the standard is for that. And is there, by contrast, an easy way to pick apart a RICO case if you're trying to?
So, I mean, I guess what I would say is it depends. I mean, everybody hates when lawyers say this, but it really depends in terms of picking apart a RICO case. It depends on the basis of the case. It depends on the players of the case. In this case, what we hear the former president say is interesting. He says things like, I did nothing wrong, or he tries to distance himself from people who we just talked about, the fake elector scheme. He tries to distance himself from that. He also does things like he speaks in code. One of the key reasons why this case even started, why the investigation even started, is that the former president called the Secretary of State, Brett Raffensperger, and said, find me 11,780 votes. So I think that the former president here will try and say, well, I thought that I was entitled to those votes. I wasn't part of, don't basically look over there to the bad guys, don't look over here. But in terms of what we're going to expect, I think we're going to expect the former president to say in court that he has First Amendment protections. I do not expect that to be particularly successful. I think we expect him to say that he was not part of this larger alleged criminal enterprise. And I think we're going to hear a lot about him claiming that he had an honest belief that he, in fact, did win the election. For a lot of detailed reasons, I don't think that's a great defense either.
Since I've got you on the line, Jessica, which is why I always enjoy talking to you, I'm going to depart for a moment from the obsession with what's going on in Fulton County and ask you about something that came up last night at the debate in Milwaukee. Former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson brought up the 14th Amendment, basically when he was arguing why he's not supporting former President Trump if he were to get the nomination. And his argument is basically that it's a real possibility that the 14th Amendment might keep the former president from becoming president again, and that has nothing to do with votes cast, but has to do with the 14th Amendment. Can you help us understand what he's arguing about, I think, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, and is it a real thing?
It is a real thing. I love this topic. I teach constitutional law. It's really interesting. I have to tell you right off the bat, I may be in the minority here. I know there's been a lot of chatter about it recently. I don't think that the former president is actually going to be kept off the ballot. But what are we talking about here? We're talking about the 14th Amendment. We're talking about Section 3. And it says that essentially people who were part of the Confederacy in the Civil War, people who the language is either engaged in an insurrection or gave aid or comfort to those who did, should not be a federal office holder, that they would be disqualified. Now, after that, though, there's a bunch of questions. Do you need to be convicted of either engaging in insurrection or aiding or abetting those who do? And I think the answer is no. You don't need a conviction based on the language of the statute. But how do we prove that you actually either engaged in the insurrection or gave aid or comfort to those who did? Who makes that decision? So what are we going to see? We're going to see a push, and we're already seeing this, that people go to state election officials, local election officials, secretaries of state, and say, look at the 14th Amendment, look at Section 3, the former president should not be on the ballot. And those people are then going to have to make decisions. What are we also going to see? We're going to see suits in states where we're suing, and who has standing? Probably another candidate, probably somebody like Chris Christie, who would say, I'm harmed by having him on the ballot because he's disqualified. We're going to see suits by potentially people like Chris Christie. And then what happens? I think the moment there's a decision by someone who says the former president is disqualified, it goes up to, you guessed it, the U.S. Supreme Court, and they're going to be in the position of interpreting this post-Civil War, very arcane section of the Constitution to determine whether or not the former president should be able to be a candidate again for the presidency.
And that will be a fascinating set of steps. If that happens, and kind of feels like in our world today, it's not out of the realm of possibilities. Jessica Levinson, thank you so much, as always, for being with us. Let's turn back to CBS News Homeland Security and Justice reporter Nicole Sganga, who joins us now from outside the jail. Nicole, Trump's motorcade is getting closer. What's the atmosphere in the few minutes since we last talked to you?
Yeah, John, there are signs that the former president's motorcade is getting closer. His advance team, a group of Secret Service agents that come in before the former president's motorcade arrived just moments ago through the entrance here, the Rice Street entrance of the Fulton County Jail. It was a smaller motorcade, but it is an indication that the former president is coming, as is law enforcement's helicopter overhead here. Secret Service doing last-minute sweeps along with law enforcement on the ground. We saw bomb dogs sniffing up and down this block where bicycle racks are lining the street, keeping all of the demonstrators and media out of the street's way for the possible arrival of former President Trump. I say possible because there are a few entrances that he could use to get into Fulton County Jail, and we do expect when he arrives that things will start to move rather quickly. His processing should take roughly 30 minutes or so, but very clear that the president is on his way.
All right. We made quick time from the airport. We want to take you now to a CBS News special report in Washington. I'm John Dickerson. We'll see you on the other side.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in the nation's capital. We are coming on the air with breaking news. As you can see, Donald Trump arriving right now at the Fulton County Jail to surrender on charges related to his attempts to overturn the results of the 2020 election loss in Georgia. Trump will be fingerprinted and a mugshot will be taken. We should note that so far, 11 of Trump's co-defendants have turned themselves in to be processed, including Rudy Giuliani, Mark Meadows, and John Eastman. The county sheriff's office said they are being treated just like anyone else that appears at this jail, although most people don't arrive in a multi-car motorcade like we're seeing there with Donald Trump. The former president was indicted 10 days ago on 13 felony counts, including conspiracy and racketeering, a charge that is often used to target members of the mob. Now, earlier this week, Trump's lawyers agreed to a $200,000 bond that prevents him from speaking with or making any direct or indirect threats to any co-defendants or witnesses in the case. We should note this is Trump's fourth criminal indictment in less than 5 months. Those are pictures from inside the motorcade there as he arrives at the jail. And CBS News correspondent Nicole Killian is outside the Fulton County Jail in Atlanta. So, Nicole, what happens once he's inside?
Yeah, well, first, Nora, I just want to let you know that this entrance right behind me is where the former president entered just moments ago, and we expect this process of him being booked to take less than an hour. As you mentioned, he will have to go through the same process as any other criminal defendant, be fingerprinted, get his height and weight taken, and his mugshot, which is something that we haven't seen before in other cases. Now, in addition to the security presence that you're probably seeing around me, on the other side of the jail, you have a number of protesters and demonstrators who have gathered to express their support for the former president, including Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who told reporters a short time time ago. She's in touch with the president, and she's very angry about what's happening right now. And that really is the sentiment that we heard from a lot of the demonstrators, some of them telling me that they feel this entire experience is demeaning for the former president, that they believe that he didn't do anything wrong, but at the same time, they feel that his surrender today could embolden him politically. But as you mentioned, this really is a surreal moment, I would say, in U.S. political history. I have covered this president on the campaign trail, at the White House, and now turning himself in tonight at the Fulton County Jail.
Nicole Killian, thank you. And as Nicole points out, former President Donald Trump already holds the ignominious distinction of being the first former president ever to face criminal charges. Tonight, even though this is the fourth indictment, we will have a mugshot for the first time. I want to bring in Robert Costa. And Robert, I understand you have some new reporting. We learned just before this appearance, Donald Trump shaking up his legal team.
Good to be with you, Nora. This is a bracing moment for American democracy to see a former president arrive at jail in Georgia, in a battleground state, all while being the Republican frontrunner. Just a day after a debate he skipped. I just got back from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Trump is not only shaking up his campaign in terms of skipping the debate and trying to hold on to his position, but he's been shaking up his legal team. Drew Finling, who was his longtime lawyer in Georgia, worked on this agreement about how he was going to handle Bond. He's now out. Trump has brought in a new lawyer, Stephen Sadow, a veteran criminal lawyer, to deal with the legal issues in Georgia. And this is complicated. This is RICO-style prosecution, as you said in your introduction. And that means it's a sprawling case, and we have the whole cast of characters from that post-election period in 2020. It's almost by the hour, a new mugshot seems to emerge, and later tonight, perhaps one of former President Trump.
I want to bring in our CBS News legal analyst, Ricky Kleeman, on this very matter, because I know, Ricky, you know the former president's new lawyer very well. Tell us about Stephen Sadow. What's his expertise? What do you think his legal strategy will be?
I've known Stephen Sadow for decades. I have tried cases with him, cases that were complex conspiracy cases that lasted many months. So he is someone who we would say is a man who understands and knows the law. He's the person that you turn to when you want to know about the legal definition of something. He's a person you turn to when you want to know the rules of evidence or the rules of procedure. He has an extraordinary memory. In court, he can cite a case to a judge off the top of his head for precisely the principle that it represents. He also has an interesting aura, Nora. He is quiet. When he comes in, he'll take his position, and when he speaks, believe me, you turn and listen. In terms of strategy, he is also aggressive. He is someone who knows how to file motions. He knows how to argue them. So I think that we will find, just as we might have found with Drew Finley, a very aggressive motion practice, particularly dealing with motions to dismiss this RICO indictment as well as the other charges.
Ricky, I have to ask you, because Donald Trump has been turned down by a number of high-profile attorneys. Why do you think Stephen would want to be involved in this case?
I think Steve Sadow is a true believer. I think he believes that every person accused is entitled to the best defense. I don't think that this is political for him in any way. In fact, I don't even know Steve's politics, but I would not guess that they are in favor of Donald Trump. But he is not someone who goes out and exposes his own personal views. He likes being a trial lawyer. He wanted to be a trial lawyer from the time he was a young man, even a boy, and he likes the idea of combat. And this is a perfect case to be able to go into the courtroom and show that his strategy, his tactics can rule.
Ricky Kleeman, thank you. I want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Major Garrett. And, you know, you look at the consent bond order, $200,000, these 13 charges, multiple criminal conspiracy charges, filing false documents, false statements, and, of course, that violation of the RICO Act. So some very serious charges. At the same time, an incredible moment in American history.
It is an incredible moment that is obvious, and we can't underscore it enough. This has been a summer of indictments for the United States of a former president, each of them historic in its own right. But if I could borrow or maybe paraphrase George Orwell from his 1947 novella, Animal Farm, some indictments are more equal than others. I think this one is more significant for the future of this constitutional republic. Why? Because what are the issues involved? And who is the aggrieved party? The aggrieved party is the state of Georgia. Under the Constitution, ratified in 1789, Article 1 and Article 2 specify states are in control of time, manner, and place of elections. And electors that elect presidents are defined in Article 2 of the Constitution. Everything about that process is a state interest. Georgia is the state that is bringing this case. Yes, through a county attorney, but it's the laws of Georgia and how it administers its election that is the violated party here. So this case is going to turn on states and their relationship to conducting their elections, and is there a federal presidential interest in interfering or trying to overturn what a state has done in terms of an election? Georgia is arguing forcefully, no, it's not. And the conduct of the former president violated that state's rights to conduct its election in its way under the Constitution. That's what's at stake. That's enormously large for not only Donald Trump, all the other implicated defendants, but the furtherance of this great political experiment known as the Constitutional Republic of the United States.
You're looking now at live pictures of the Fulton County Jail. This is a notorious jail, or actually it's under Department of Justice investigation. 7 inmates have died this year there, so it is a tough place. And the former president inside now, being booked, being fingerprinted, likely a mugshot taken, and as was noted, he is going to have his height and weight recorded, being treated just like anyone else who goes inside that jail, and that is where he is now. Also want to bring in Scott McFarland, who is with us, who has covered all of these legal issues so closely. Walk us through some of these counts.
There are 19 criminal defendants in one case. That's just striking fundamentally. And they're charged with racketeering, which is in itself a crime that has enormous breadth and scope. The image that's jumping out at me is the one we're not seeing, Nora. We don't see Donald Trump walking into the jail. The traveling press pool didn't capture that image. They were kept a distance away, just like when he entered the Washington, D.C. federal jail earlier this month. He's still able to control some of the optics. Didn't have that image shared with America. There are 7 others who've still yet to surrender themselves in this case. They have until 12 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow to do so. And the biggest name on that list is a name we've heard so much since the 2020 election, Jeffrey Clark, the former Trump administration Justice Department official who in the 11th hour, the final days of the administration, allegedly sought to overturn the election results and seize control of the Department of Justice. I mentioned his name in particular, Nora, because he's going to challenge, much like former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows is, to move this case from Fulton County to federal court. The judge has just set a hearing for Jeffrey Clark for September 18th on that matter, but he still has to surrender. And Nora, if they were to succeed to move this case to federal court, a couple things change. The projected jury pool goes from just Fulton County to all of the Northern District of Georgia, and it takes the cameras out of the courtroom if this were ever to go to trial.
So that's a very important distinction, because as it stands now, the press has been granted the right to have cameras in the courtroom. That would change the dynamic greatly.
Federal courts prohibit cameras universally. That's why there will not be one in Washington, D.C., nor will there be one in Fort Pierce, Florida. If they're able to shift this to federal court, the same is true in Georgia. Mark Meadows makes the same argument Monday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern, to move this case to federal court. If there's any inkling that's going to succeed, it's quite likely former President Trump will try to make the same shift.
It's an important question, and I'll defer to Ricky because she's the legal expert here, but I've read the district attorney's response to this, saying nothing that has been alleged is part of the ordinary carrying out of duties of a chief of staff or a president. They're outside of those bounds. Therefore, they are state crimes, and therefore the jurisdiction should hold. But again, I defer to Ricky. But the response from the district attorney is very forceful on the points of law and conduct.
The former Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, surrendering earlier. We have his mugshot from earlier today. Striking to see the former White House Chief of Staff in a mugshot, and of course just yesterday, Rudy Giuliani, which of course that mugshot of him, America's mayor, who led New York City with distinction after 9/11, and then has been embroiled in these legal matters since representing and giving advice to Donald Trump, a fall from grace that has cost him greatly, not only personally, but financially as well.
Who, before becoming mayor, earned a reputation as an aggressive prosecutor, prosecuting, among other things, RICO cases in the Southern District of New York, where in some cases, lawyers were also prosecuted by Rudy Giuliani.
He appeared before cameras yesterday in New York City outside his apartment before heading down to Georgia. And I don't know about you guys, but he seemed upset. He seemed really moved by what he was facing, and I sensed a different tone from him than I've ever sensed before. The weight of this, when you have a mugshot taken, being fingerprinted after spending most of your life prosecuting criminals. Particularly personal for Rudy Giuliani.
I think about that line from the film All the President's Men when Deep Throat's in the garage with Woodward, Robert Redford's character, and said things got a little bit out of hand with All the President's Men, with Watergate. And with Georgia, it's important to step back and ask yourself, well, why are we watching all this right now? What is going on with Georgia years after the 2020 election? What happened? Well, here's what happened, and briefly as possible. After 2020, and Trump is defeated by then President-elect Biden in November 2020, Trump goes to Giuliani, and he says, my campaign lawyers are not giving me any good answers. I need answers that I can stay in office. And Giuliani says, well, let's fight it in the courts. So they do that throughout November 2020. They fail. Then in December 2020, Trump and Giuliani huddle with a few others, including Sidney Powell, who's one of the indicted people in this RICO case, an outside conservative lawyer, among others. And they said, well, we can't win with the court, so what are we going to do? And they come up with a scheme to pressure states to send alternate electors. And during the course of my reporting with Bob Woodward, we discovered a memo authored by John Eastman, who also has a mugshot, also indicted in this RICO case, which said to Trump, if you lean on states, somehow they can, with special sessions, irregular legislative sessions, or even just pressuring with activists, they can create these new slates of electors. And they really focused on Georgia because they believe Georgia was a ruby red state that was primed to do what Trump wanted. I always think about Trump's rally on the night of January 4th, 2021. Trump goes to Georgia famously or infamously, depending on whom you ask, and he says, Mike Pence, you better do what I want on January 6th, and the whole crowd in Georgia goes wild. Everybody's down in Georgia saying Georgia's going to be the state that puts it over the line for Trump on January 6th. The lieutenant governor of Georgia now, Burt Jones, was in Washington on January 5th to meet with Vice President Pence, just to say hello, to say maybe you should think about changing your mind on January 6th. So Georgia became this cauldron of activity. Everybody was going there to ask the governor, Brian Kemp, to have a special session and to send those alternate electors. But ultimately, they didn't, and Kemp remains a foe of Trump. And now Georgia is this microcosm of the broader story we've been covering for a long time of January 6th and American democracy.
That state decided by less than 12,000 votes.
And there's an intervening event there in Bob's beautiful narrative. The special election is conducted for 2 Senate races. Both go to Democrats. Every Republican you talk to in Georgia now will tell you if Trump and his allies weren't so obsessively focused on the 2020 election, but put in for those races, those might have been won by the Republicans. There wouldn't have been a governing, though narrow, majority for Biden in the Senate, and much of the things that Biden has gotten through would not have happened. That was a crucial 72 hours, not only in the history of Georgia politics, but the ramifications for Congress and the Biden administration and former President Trump. And in the primaries recently, there was a referendum on Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger. They both won their primaries. So if Republicans in Georgia were aggrieved by all of these things that Trump talked about, they would have cast their ballots differently. They didn't.
We are just learning that Donald Trump has been booked, according to Fulton County Jail records, a number attached to that. And of course, what's looming is whether there'll be a mugshot of the former president, that it will be seen around the world, Robert.
And you said Rudy Giuliani's tone has changed, but this is a grim story for those beyond those in power. Ruby Freeman and others, they have said they were maligned by Giuliani and Trump during that period.
Well, our coverage will continue on CBS News, streaming your local news. And for some of you, we'll have a full wrap-up tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in Washington.
Hello, everyone. I'm John Dickerson. Former President Donald Trump is in Atlanta, inside the Fulton County Jail. He is being processed by officials after surrendering on 13 criminal counts against him. He landed in Atlanta less than an hour ago, made his way to the jail from his Trump airplane there, the 757, with the motorcade that we are so used to seeing. The former president and 18 co-defendants are indicted for their role in efforts to overturn the 2020 election in Georgia. And we are expected to see a booking photo from the former president. We have been told that he has, in fact, been booked. And that booking photo, also known as a mugshot, will be forthcoming, as it has been with the other members of the indicted group that have already had their booking photo taken. CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian joins us from outside the Fulton County Jail in Atlanta. Nicole, set the scene for us there as twilight breaks.
Well, at this point, we're just waiting for the former president to exit the jail. We know that he has been processed and booked according to jail records, but this entrance right here, right behind me, is where we saw his motorcade go in, flanked by motorcycles and SUVs and, what you normally see when a president is going to an official event. So a bit surreal to see a motorcade like that enter a local jail. But the former president now has to face these 13 counts that he was charged with in Fani Willis's indictment. This was an indictment that was handed up by a grand jury earlier this month for his alleged efforts to conspire to overturn the 2020 election here in Georgia. So that is why he is being processed here today. No one is being let off the hook. Pretty much all of his co-defendants, many of them have surrendered or either reached bond agreements. They only have until tomorrow at noon to turn themselves in. Otherwise, the district attorney has threatened to issue a warrant for their arrest.
It's a great point, Nicole. The protections and comforts of being a former president now encased in the pretty rough quarters of the Fulton County Jail, where he is going through all of this. In terms of what's happening outside, in Miami, we saw a lot of pro-Trump protesters. There was a bit of a circus atmosphere. What's it like there now? And was there any response as the former president arrived?
Well, we are in a secure perimeter in part, excuse me, because the former president was brought in this way. So this street behind me has been closed to vehicle traffic, and pedestrian traffic has been very limited. So most of those demonstrators and protesters that you're referring to are at a different side of the jail. And I would say at any given point in time, maybe we saw a few dozen throughout the day just before the former president turned himself in. Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene showed up, and she told reporters that she's been in constant contact with the former president. She blasted this investigation by District Attorney Fani Willis as a witch hunt, and said she's very angry about what's happening. And that really has been the sentiment that we have heard from a number of the former president's supporters who truly believe that he did not do anything wrong. Some of them telling me they still think the election was stolen, even though many of the former president's claims, if not all of them, have been debunked on numerous levels, not just here in the state of Georgia, but also on a federal level and in other states. So that being said, many of them still feel that this surrender today will embolden the former president politically, and that is why they are backing him and still see him as their candidate for 2024.
Nicole Killian outside the Fulton County Jail in Atlanta. Thank you so much, Nicole. As we mentioned, there are a slew of unique legal aspects to Donald Trump's Georgia election interference case. And so we are lucky to have CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman, who joins me now. Ricky, I want to step back for a minute and get your assessment of the strength of the case, the RICO case against the former president, before we wrestle with some of these more immediate details.
I think there can be no doubt that this case is strong. It consists of 98 pages. You have a story that is told by 161 overt acts. And what those are paragraphs describing each action that each defendant took according to the prosecution. You also have specific crimes after that, which various defendants are charged with. There is no doubt that the case is mammoth. It's one of those cases, John, that if it does in fact go to trial with any number of defendants, let's call it 10 defendants, and 9 of them plead, or let's call it 19 defendants, that this is a trial that will take months, could even take a year. RICO cases are complex by their very nature, John, because the acts of one become attributable to the acts of all.
Right. So I want to ask you now about former President Trump's his new attorney, Stephen Sadow, who is representing him in Georgia. You've actually tried cases with Sadow. What can you tell him? And then I want to ask you about a specific act he took today. But what is his what's he like, and what does this mean about the legal strategy that the president is likely to adopt?
Well, I've tried cases with Steve Sadow for years. Years ago, we tried cases that were big conspiracy cases, multiple defendant cases that lasted months on end. When you get to know someone in that way, when a group of defense attorneys decides to rent a large house and be able to work together as many hours as you are possibly awake, you understand what people's expertise really is. Steve Sadow is what I call the law man. He is someone who everyone would turn to about issues of law, issues of evidence, issues of procedure. He's someone who has an extraordinary memory where a judge can ask him for a precedent and without any paperwork in front of him, he can come forward with the law of the case from some case long ago. So in this particular indictment, one of the things that Steve Sadow is going to do is file a flurry of motions having to do with motions to dismiss. And he's not only going to want to dismiss the entire indictment outright, but he'll go count by count. And this is someone who carries himself in a way, John, where when he speaks, you listen. He is someone who has an aura of authority. He is not a showman. He is not a showboater. He is a real lawyer.
So what then do you make of his decision today? And Kenneth Chesebro, who is another named member of this RICO case. Chesebro, a lawyer, asked to have a speedy trial and has apparently been granted it. Trial is set for the 23rd of October. And Sadow has asked to sever former President Trump from Chesebro. What do you make of all that machinations?
Well, it was a very smart move. It was a smart move, John, and he did it fast. There is no way that Donald Trump, or probably most, if not all, of the other defendants would want a speedy trial. Many of these lawyers, not just Steve Sadow, but many of these lawyers have just been brought on this case. The amount of material that they have to digest in order to be able to get ready to try the case on October 23rd, that's almost an absurdity. It almost cannot be done, even with those 24/7 work schedules. So you move to sever. Let Chesebro have a speedy trial. Donald Trump doesn't want a speedy trial. And in great part because Donald Trump wants to take his time to file these motions. So I think that Sadow's move was appropriate. It was smart.
Let me ask you this very quickly, Ricky. What's Chesebro's game then? Why does he want it to move quickly? And just from a political perspective, I'll just ask you one question at a time. Why would he want to move quickly?
Heaven only knows, John. I have no idea. The only thing that he could have done was to try to call Fani Willis's bluff. Fani Willis said she was ready. So it is perhaps possible that Chesebro's lawyers decided to see if she really meant it. Because you understand that when you move for a speedy trial, if that trial does not occur, the sanction is dismissal. So he may have really taken her up and on her words, and she says she's ready to go.
A lot more of those nights with very little sleep ahead for a whole bunch of lawyers. Ricky Kleeman, thanks so much for being with us. As we've been covering, former President Donald Trump has left the Fulton County Jail after being booked by officials in the Georgia 2020 election criminal case. He faces 13 counts, including